Hi GI, Ray Bakerton with the Wounded Artist Project. And again, we're doing another video here. This time we're speaking with Mr. Peter Carrington. How are you today, Peter?
Life is good.
Thank you. Thank you very much for helping us out.
Pleasure.
And Peter is a scientific illustrator. You've done some medical illustration in the past as well. But we're going to be talking today about this trade, scientific illustration, because we have a number of fields that we'd like you all to consider. We've talked to architects so far. You've seen some product design work, and those relate to being able to do perspective drawing or liking to draw cars and other kinds of things, lawnmowers or toasters, whatever it is. But in this case, we're talking with Peter, and we'll try and find other scientific illustrators with the idea that, you know, maybe you're not into perspective drawing and maybe you don't like drawing cars and toasters. Maybe you really got interested, you know, having been in the hospital, you got interested in the natural world. You like looking at you know, maybe you see skeletons and models and things like that, and maybe you're just more interested in the natural world. And we believe that you can probably make a living doing that, and that's why we're here to talk to Peter today. That's our brief intro, and Peter, we want to start off with, how do you think you got interested in this? I mean, were you drawing as a kid, and how do you want to describe that? We want to relate drawing to this and your profession, please.
Well, this kind of drawing is really an excellent avenue for a person who has an interest in some of the objects in the natural world and an interest in a certain amount of hand-eye drawing type skills. For me, I started out in the science of entomology as an insect collecting maniac kid. And eventually, when I was doing research in an obscure group of insects, of which the silverfish, the household silverfish, is the main English known example. Not so much earwigs. They're in the other end of the insect kingdom, probably. So illustrating my own research was really the first impetus I had with that. But the nice thing about this kind of drawing is that especially in the development stage, you're serving your interest in the natural world. So what I would counsel anyone who thinks that this might be an avenue for them, start out by drawing the things that you personally have a passion for. If you're the kind of person who's been interested in minerals and geology, the crystals, the architecture of crystals, the way pegmatite minerals come together, these kind of things, you know, all are very excellent subjects. If you're into plants or insects or astronomy or birds or reptiles, I mean, these are all areas that are perfectly excellent for tutoring yourself literally into a career in science drawing.
So rocks, redwoods, and rhinos then? Anything,
sure,
anything
yes.
in between?
Although, before you bring the rhino home, you'll want to study anesthetics.
Yeah.
But,
maybe just picture resource.
Right, sure.
But
you know, they can be done for photos too.
By the way, where are we right now? What is your position here? We didn't just find you on the street.
Well, at the moment, my position is I'm the Assistant Curator of the WJ Beale Botanical Garden. But before
here
this,
at Michigan State
here
University.
at Michigan State University in East Lansing, Michigan. But before my last job, I was actually the science illustrator for the College of Natural Science. And so that was a wonderful job because it gave me a chance to draw everything from malaria-carrying mosquitoes all the way to geological formations, all the way to schematic illustrations of how lasers work. Things like that.
Really?
These are all the kinds, all things that fall into the aegis of a science illustration.
Oh, so there is even a little bit of like product design and.
Well, in a way, you know, a lot of times a person might approach you not so much to have a perfect rendering of a research material, so much as to help them interpret to the public a complicated either mechanism. For instance, I did a drawing that had to do with the way a seed converts starch into the sugars that it uses when it's actually starting its germination and growth. And there's a fair amount of seed anatomy in a thing like that. But most of it is almost like an animated cartoon in a way that you construct once you understand the science to help a person who is basically a civilian in that area of science understand the mechanism. And so a lot of creativity is involved, and of course in a drawing like that, there's not a great deal of, you're not exactly copying a natural object, you're using your own sense of your understanding to show where molecules are going in an intelligible way, and trying to make it look consistent with the realities as you've studied them about this process.
Right.
And it sounds simple in a way, but people screw this up regularly, you know, and so it makes some of the subjects hard to learn for folks. And ultimately, all science illustration is an act of education. You are taking something that you and maybe your research sponsor have studied or at least learned together, and you're using your hand, sense of design, sense of paper, sense of whatever you're working with in a medium, to make this intelligible to people who do not have that extensively detailed background.
Right.
And so by doing this, you make it accessible to that person, and you may end up making a beautiful object at the same time.
Okay, and when you mention this, being able to describe these scientific subjects, so we still want to be able to understand science to some degree. We can't just draw this and put, you know, item A on it. I mean, you still have to have a certain knowledge about what these natural objects are. So I mean,
sure, and I would counsel a person who's looking at this kind of drawing. One of the reasons you want to pick something that you have a passion for is that not only are your keen abilities to observe this either process or object or whatever you've decided to render here, but also the underpinning of knowledge that you've gained about it. Looking up the anatomy of that flower before you draw it, looking up the anatomy of that shell before you draw it. Your passion for that object now becomes blended with a certain level of knowledge. And of course, one of the reasons that an illustration very often serves much better than a photograph is because although a photograph clearly gives a realistic sense of the object in the visual image way, by being a science illustrator, you allow your knowledge of that object to demonstrate the anatomy in a way that may not be obvious in the photograph. For instance, when you're identifying a plant, you know, a lot of people go out there and they say, well, I need a color photograph to identify a plant. Well, a color photograph can deceive as easily as it can enrich. And when you do a drawing, you know that you want that person to look for the opposite arrangement of leaf pattern. You know you want them to look for a singly serrated edge. You know that you want them to see the stipules at the leaf base. These are things that can be obscure in a photograph, and even a beautiful photograph of the plant may not go very far towards seeking its identity at all. And if you've ever tried to identify things on racks of images on the internet, you know very well that you could look through a ton of great pictures that don't help you identify duha.
Is that a scientific term?
That's a scientific term. You'll want to look that up.
Thank you.
But that is where the illustrator can step in, because they can actually point out, this is what to look for here. This is what to see right here.
You're actually talking the top and the bottom of the leaf in the same picture then.
Possibly, or not.
But looking at a flower pot and you just see all the tops.
You know, a lot of times when a photographer photographs a plant, he'll photograph a very beautiful maybe aspect of the flower. Well, maybe the flower happens 2.5 months after the useful part. You know, and you need to know how can this be determined by its leaves? What about the texture of this thing separates it from the other plants in the genus? What about the markings on this moth separate this horribly invasive pest from this native that everyone loves? You know,
or is useful.
Exactly.
You might eradicate a moth that was maybe feeding on some. No, I'm serious. Feeding on some parasite and something else.
You bet. So